At the beginning of 1943, the North African campaign had entered its final stage. After the defeat at El Alamein in November 1942 and the subsequent Allied landings in North Africa during Operation Torch, the German-Italian Afrika Korps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was pushed into an ever-shrinking pocket in Tunisia. From the east, the British Eighth Army under Montgomery advanced from Egypt and Libya. From the west, American and British forces, having landed successfully in Algeria and Morocco, pressed forward. These two pincers steadily closed in, trapping the Axis forces. The Axis' strategic position in North Africa was extremely dire. After months of continuous fighting, their numbers were depleted, equipment was scarce, fuel was nearly exhausted, and seaborne supply lines were critically threatened. The Mediterranean had once been the Axis lifeline. All food, ammunition, and fuel had to be shipped from Italy and Sicily to Tunisia or Libya. By early 1943, however, this route was virtually paralyzed. The Royal Navy, together with Allied aircraft operating from Malta, had turned the Mediterranean into a graveyard for Axis shipping. Transport vessels were sunk one after another, escorts proved insufficient, and seaborne resupply had become nearly impossible. In this situation, the German High Command was forced to rely almost entirely on air transport. The Luftwaffe deployed hundreds of Junkers Ju-52 transports alongside a few heavy-lift aircraft, such as the Messerschmitt Me-323 Gigant, to ferry supplies from Sicily to Tunisia and evacuate wounded personnel, engineers, and logistics staff back to Italy. The Ju-52, a tri-motor aircraft that had been the backbone of the Luftwaffe's transport fleet since the start of the war, had proven its worth in Norway, the Battle of France, and Crete in 1941. But by 1943, it was outdated, slow, poorly defended, and easy prey for modern Allied fighters. Aware of the risks, the Germans adopted several countermeasures. Ju-52s often flew extremely low, only 5,100 meters above the sea, to evade radar and complicate interception. Transport groups flew in V formations for mutual defense, with onboard machine guns providing overlapping fields of fire. Experienced fighter units such as JG-27 and JG-53, flying Messerschmitt Bf-109s, were assigned as escorts. Flight times were varied to prevent predictable patterns. In theory, these tactics increased the odds of survival. In practice, they proved futile, because the Allies already had advanced knowledge of nearly every move through code-breaking intelligence. By late 1942, cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park had broken most variations of the German military Enigma cipher. This allowed the ultra-intelligence system to read almost all Luftwaffe operational communications. With near real-time information, Allied air commanders in North Africa knew exactly when convoys would depart from Sicily, how many aircraft would be involved, which escort units were assigned, their destination in Tunisia, and even their flight paths. This was an extraordinary advantage that rendered all German secrecy measures useless. Armed with ultra-intelligence, the U.S. Air Force launched Operation Flax in early April 1943. Its objective was to strangle the Axis air supply line to the Afrika Korps. Unlike earlier piecemeal interceptions, Flax was systematic. Allied squadrons based in Tunisia, Algeria, and Malta were positioned to strike at the exact time and place revealed by intelligence. Whenever Ju-52s or Italian SM-82 transports appeared, Allied fighters were vectored to intercept. On April 5, 1943, the first ambushes took place, costing the Luftwaffe 14 Ju-52s. On April 10th, another 20 were shot down. These losses were heavy, but the Germans could not abandon daylight transport flights. The need to supply Tunisia was too desperate. Meanwhile, U.S. fighter groups in North Africa were intensively trained for transport hunting missions. The 57th Fighter Group, equipped with Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, practiced coordinated group tactics and gunnery at the optimal range of 250 meters, perfect for cutting down slow, cumbersome transports. Their .50 caliber machine guns were harmonized to concentrate firepower. RAF Spitfire squadrons provided top cover, engaging German escorts at higher altitudes to free the P-40s to strike the vulnerable transports. On the ground, Axis forces in Tunisia were nearing collapse. Around 250,000 German and Italian troops, including the Afrika Korps, were encircled. Without aerial supply, they could not hold out much longer. The Luftwaffe, desperate, threw every available aircraft into life-or-death flights, regardless of losses. Ironically, this only increased the risk, as larger formations created ideal targets for Allied ambushes. On April 18, 1943, Palm Sunday, the decisive moment arrived. Ultra-intercepts warned that a massive convoy of about 65 Ju-52s would fly from Tunisia back to Sicily in the afternoon, escorted by roughly 15 Bf-109s and several Bf-110s. This was the largest air convoy yet, carrying wounded troops, engineers, logistics staff, and critical supplies. Destroying it would deal not only a material blow, but also a devastating psychological shock to the Luftwaffe. The U.S. command immediately ordered the entire 57th Fighter Group, along with 12 RAF Spitfires, to set up an ambush. The battle erupted over Cape Bon, Tunisia, and lasted less than 15 minutes. The result was catastrophic for the Axis. History would remember it as the Palm Sunday Massacre. It was not just a brilliantly executed ambush. It marked the beginning of the end for the Luftwaffe in the Mediterranean and demonstrated the rising dominance of American air power. On the afternoon of April 18, 1943, the skies over eastern Tunisia were eerily calm. It was Palm Sunday, a time when many soldiers on the ground were preparing for a religious observance. But above them, a massacre was about to unfold. A battle that would last less than 15 minutes, yet leave an indelible mark on the history of global warfare. According to ultra-intelligence decrypts, around 4:00 p.m., a massive Luftwaffe transport convoy would appear. About 65 Junkers Ju-52s, loaded with wounded soldiers, logistics staff, engineers, and supplies, were scheduled to fly from Tunisia back to the safety of bases in Sicily. It was one of the largest airlifts ever mounted by the Germans in North Africa. Escorting them were roughly 15 Messerschmitt Bf-109s and several Bf-110s. The Germans hoped that flying in large numbers, at low altitude, with fighter support, would be enough to see the formation home. What they did not know was that their plan had been completely compromised. On the Allied side, the U.S. Army Air Force's 57th Fighter Group, equipped with Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, was ordered into the air from Tunisia. Its 3 squadrons, the Fighting Cocks, Black Scorpions, and Desert Rats, were positioned at low altitude, ready to dive into the transport formation. Meanwhile, 12 RAF Spitfire MK-Vrs provided top cover at higher altitude, ready to block any Bf-109s attempting to intervene. In total, more than 50 Allied fighters took part in the ambush. The decisive moment came around 4:30 p.m. as the Ju-52s crossed the Cape Bon coastline. From a distance, American pilots spotted dozens of silver specks flying low and tightly packed. The Ju-52, nicknamed Tante Ju, Auntie Ju, lumbered along at just 200 km/h, close together and nearly incapable of evasive maneuvers. For the P-40 pilots, it was the perfect target. Slow, cumbersome transports packed with men, defended only by a few machine guns in their fuselage and tail. The attack order was given. The P-40 squadrons broke formation, diving from 2 directions to slash across the convoy. Their 50 caliber machine guns opened fire at ranges of 200-250 meters, spitting long bursts of tracers. In the very first volleys, multiple Ju-52s burst into flames. Some ignited fuel tanks and exploded instantly into fireballs that plunged into the sea. Others attempted emergency landings on the water only to break apart or sink. One American pilot later recalled the scene as resembling a flock of geese being shot down en masse, the transports utterly helpless. Within the first few minutes, at least 20 Ju-52s had been destroyed. The American fighters circled back, making second and third attack runs. Because the transports flew so close together, many collided while trying to evade, worsening the carnage. Flames and black smoke blanketed the skies over Cape Bon as wreckage scattered across the sea. Meanwhile, the German escorts, the Bf-109s, dove in to defend the convoy. But the task was impossible. The Ju-52 formation was too large and unwieldy, while the Allied Spitfires held the high ground. Every time a Bf-109 tried to reach the low-flying P-40s, a Spitfire swooped down to intercept. Several German fighters were shot down in the attempt. Some brave Luftwaffe pilots did hurl themselves into the fray, but hopelessly outnumbered and disadvantaged, they achieved little. Within minutes, the escorts were scattered and depleted, leaving the Ju-52s exposed. The American pilots attacked methodically. They broke into groups of 4, each group tearing into a section of the convoy. Some dove at the head of the formation, shredding the lead transports and throwing the rest into disarray. Others raked the flanks, hammering the unarmored fuselages. A few P-40s even flew parallel at point-blank range, unleashing their entire ammunition load before pulling up, leaving Ju-52s exploding behind them. In less than 15 minutes, almost the entire convoy was annihilated. Estimates put the losses at between 59 and 61 Ju-52s destroyed, roughly 90% of the force. The few survivors either crash-landed in Tunisia or limped away too badly damaged to continue operations. Several Bf-109s and Bf-110s were also shot down, bringing total Axis losses to catastrophic levels. The human toll was even worse. Thousands of German and Italian troops, engineers, and wounded aboard the transports perished in the inferno. Survivors were vanishingly few. Only a handful of men who parachuted out were later rescued. For the Luftwaffe, it was an unprecedented calamity. Not only did they lose dozens of irreplaceable transport aircraft, but also vital logistics and technical personnel who could not be easily replaced. When the battle ended, Cape Bon's skies were choked with smoke and debris. The American pilots returned to base, jubilant yet shaken. Never before had they witnessed such a swift and one-sided victory. One recalled, "We shot them down almost as easily as on a gunnery range, but the aftermath was horrifying. Hundreds of men died in seconds." Some pilots even admitted being haunted, feeling the encounter was more an execution than an aerial battle. For Allied commanders, the Palm Sunday Massacre demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of combining ultra-intelligence with air power tactics. Precise intelligence enabled a flawless ambush, maximizing the strengths of the P-40s and Spitfires. The Luftwaffe, completely blindsided, lost nearly its entire transport fleet in a single afternoon. The consequences went far beyond tactics. Materially, the Luftwaffe AS loss of over 60 Ju-52s in one day was a blow German industry could not replace in the short term. Psychologically, it was a crushing shock. After Palm Sunday, the Germans were forced to abandon daylight transport flights across the Mediterranean, relying only on sporadic night missions. As a result, resupply to the Afrika Korps slowed to a trickle, leaving Axis forces in Tunisia starving for fuel, ammunition, and hope. The Palm Sunday Massacre was therefore not just an air victory, it was the decisive strike that severed the last Axis lifeline in North Africa. From that point, their defeat was only a matter of time. Indeed, less than a month later, the entire Axis force in Tunisia surrendered, bringing the North African campaign to an end. The Palm Sunday Massacre was far more than a successful ambush. It marked a turning point in the entire North African campaign and reflected a fundamental shift in the balance of power over the Mediterranean skies. In just 15 minutes, dozens of Ju-52s and thousands of German-Italian troops vanished, leaving an irreparable gap in the Axis supply network. The consequences of this tragedy quickly rippled across every related front. First came the massive material losses. Within a brief span, the Luftwaffe lost nearly 60 Ju-52s, almost a quarter of its available transport fleet in the Mediterranean. The Ju-52, already an aging design from the early 1930s, was still being produced, but not in sufficient numbers to replace such losses quickly. Even if Germany sought to replenish, transferring new aircraft from Europe to the Mediterranean under Allied sea and air blockades was nearly impossible. Thus, in a single afternoon, the Luftwaffe lost its core airlift capacity, the lifeline keeping Axis forces in North Africa alive. The human toll was equally severe. Most of those aboard the Ju-52s perished. Wounded soldiers, engineers, logistics staff, and specialists. These were irreplaceable personnel for the German-Italian forces. Beyond numbers, it was a loss of quality. Skilled mechanics and logistics crews were crucial to keeping tanks, artillery, and aircraft operational at the front. With their disappearance, the maintenance and repair system in Tunisia all but collapsed, leaving the Afrika Korps, already strained, to deteriorate further. The most immediate consequence was the near paralysis of Axis supply lines in North Africa. After April 18th, the Luftwaffe was forced to cancel most daylight transport flights, relying only on a handful of small nocturnal missions. But the limited supplies could not meet the needs of over 250,000 German and Italian troops under pressure in Tunisia. Rommel and other Axis commanders had long warned of fuel and ammunition shortages. Now the situation became desperate. Once formidable tanks, Panther, Tiger, Panzer IV, sat idle, out of fuel. Artillerymen lacked shells. Infantry went hungry. Resistance turned into futility. Morale also collapsed. For the Luftwaffe, this was one of its most humiliating defeats since the start of the war. The sight of Ju-52s shot down en masse shattered any belief in German air superiority. Transport pilots panicked at every new mission. Even seasoned fighter escorts realized they could no longer match the overwhelming Allied advantage. The Mediterranean skies, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, now firmly belonged to the British and Americans. Strategically, the Palm Sunday Massacre helped seal the fate of the entire North African campaign. Just 3 weeks later, in May 1943, over 250,000 German and Italian troops in Tunisia surrendered to the Allies, one of the largest Axis capitulations of the war, rivaling Stalingrad in scale. The surrender ended Axis presence in Africa and paved the way for the next Allied operations, the invasion of Sicily and later mainland Italy. A crucial factor behind the massacre was ultra-intelligence. Enigma decrypts gave the Allies precise details about the German transport schedule, formation, and numbers. Without this intelligence, arranging such a perfect ambush at Cape Bon would have been nearly impossible. The Palm Sunday Massacre thus stands as a textbook example of how signals intelligence combined with air power could decide the fate of tens of thousands. For the U.S. Army Air Forces, the battle carried special meaning. It was one of the first times American squadrons demonstrated overwhelming dominance in a major Mediterranean air battle. The 57th Fighter Group, flying P-40 Warhawks often considered inferior to Spitfires or Bf-109s, proved their worth through disciplined training and coordination. Their success boosted morale and showcased America's rise as an air power equal to and soon surpassing Britain. The massacre also offered a sobering lesson on airlift doctrine. Before the war, Germany had pioneered transport aircraft in blitzkrieg strategy. The Ju-52 had been crucial in early campaigns, dropping paratroopers into Norway, the Netherlands, and Greece. But by 1943, the world had changed. The outdated Ju-52s were death traps against modern fighters. Cape Bon proved that air transport could succeed only under conditions of absolute air superiority. Once skies were lost, transports became little more than flying targets. Both the U.S. and the Soviet Union would later heed this lesson in developing large-scale airlift operations in the 1940s-1950s. For Germany, the defeat revealed the strategic blindness of Hitler and the High Command. Instead of withdrawing early from North Africa to save their forces, they clung stubbornly to hopeless positions, forcing the Luftwaffe into impossible missions. The Palm Sunday Massacre thus symbolized Axis obstinacy and delusion in decline. In the memory of survivors and later historians, the Palm Sunday Massacre became known as a 15-minute battle that changed an entire campaign. It has often been compared to other Luftwaffe airlift disasters, such as the heavy losses of paratroopers in Crete in 1941, but Cape Bon was even harsher in its absolute imbalance and comprehensive destruction. More broadly, the battle foreshadowed a new trend in warfare: the seamless integration of intelligence, technology, and firepower. The 20th century saw countless decisive battles fought with bombs and bullets, but few illustrated the power of information so clearly. It is no coincidence that many historians describe Cape Bon as Bletchley Park AS victory in the skies over Tunisia. After the war, the Palm Sunday Massacre was studied in military academies as a model of aerial ambush, surprise, flawless squadron coordination, and absolute information dominance produced a swift and devastating victory. It became a blueprint for the concept of air superiority, the command of the skies, that remains the foundation of modern air warfare. The Palm Sunday Massacre, fought on April 18, 1943, over Cape Bon, Tunisia, was one of the shortest yet most consequential air battles of the entire Second World War. In less than 15 minutes, a massive Luftwaffe transport formation of about 65 Ju-52s was almost completely annihilated by U.S. and British fighters. The outcome was not merely a numerical victory, but a strategic blow that directly contributed to the collapse of Axis forces in North Africa. Looking back, the event yields lessons whose significance extends far beyond a single engagement. First, the Palm Sunday Massacre was clear proof of the supreme importance of air superiority in modern warfare. The Luftwaffe had once dominated European skies in the early years of the war, enabling the success of blitzkrieg. But by 1943, the balance had shifted. Thanks to vast industrial power and rigorous training systems, the U.S. and British air forces could deploy hundreds of fighters simultaneously, overwhelming every German defensive effort. Once the Allies controlled North African skies, German air transport turned into a suicide mission. The Palm Sunday Massacre thus exemplified the principle that even the most battle-hardened ground force is doomed if it lacks protection from above. Second, the battle underscored the decisive role of intelligence in warfare. Without ultra-decrypts at Bletchley Park, the Allies could not have staged such a flawless ambush. German transport groups often flew low, altering schedules and routes to evade interception. Yet by reading Enigma, the Allies knew the exact timetable, flight path, number of aircraft, and even escort strength. This golden intelligence rendered German precautions meaningless. The Palm Sunday Massacre proved that in modern war, control of information often equals control of victory. Another defining feature of the battle was the sheer imbalance. Outdated, slow Ju-52s stood no chance against P-40s and Spitfires. Many U.S. pilots later admitted the action felt more like an execution than combat. But this exposed a deeper flaw in German strategy. Continued reliance on the Ju-52, a design from the 1930s, under conditions of total Allied air superiority, was evidence of both conservatism and desperation. The massacre became the graveyard of German airlift doctrine, once celebrated during the early Blitzkrieg years. From the Allied perspective, the battle had enormous symbolic value. It was among the first times U.S. air units demonstrated large-scale coordination and overwhelming effectiveness in the Mediterranean. The 57th Fighter Group, flying P-40 Warhawks often dismissed as inferior to the Bf-109, showed that superiority lay not only in technical performance, but also in organization, training, and tactical coordination. Their success boosted American morale and reinforced Allied confidence that they were strong enough to assault Fortress Europe in coming operations. The Palm Sunday Massacre also highlighted a hard truth. Logistics are the Achilles heel of any army. The Afrika Korps did not lack courage or capable leaders like Rommel, but once supply lines were severed, everything collapsed. Mighty Tiger IIs became useless hulks without fuel. Infantry, no matter how brave, could not fight on empty stomachs and without ammunition. The battle showed that wars are won not only by direct clashes, but by sustaining supply. Germany did not lose North Africa for lack of willpower, but for lack of logistics. Compared with other great air battles of the war, Palm Sunday stood apart. The Battle of Britain in 1940 was a balanced contest of endurance and skillful dogfighting. Midway in 1942 was a complex duel between carriers and dive bombers. But Palm Sunday was a different kind of engagement, an absolute ambush enabled by intelligence, in which one side had virtually no chance to respond. It was less dramatic in tactical terms, but rich in strategic consequence. The long-term impact extended beyond North Africa. With German-Italian forces surrendering in Tunisia in May 1943, the Allies could immediately launch Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. The fall of North Africa and collapse of Axis supply lines through the Mediterranean opened the gateway into Europe's soft underbelly. The Palm Sunday Massacre was thus one of the key blows that allowed the Allies to build overwhelming momentum for their assault on Italy and eventually Germany itself. On a human level, the event remains controversial. Some survivors and historians have called it an aerial massacre because of the extreme disparity and huge casualties. Within minutes, thousands perished in flames, many of them wounded soldiers and logistics staff, not frontline combatants. Though it was war, the scale and nature of the losses raised questions about the fine line between military victory and humanitarian tragedy. The massacre showed how modern warfare, empowered by intelligence and technology, could produce devastation on an almost unimaginable scale. For today's military, the Palm Sunday Massacre is often studied as a textbook case of aerial ambush. 3 factors ensured success. 1. Precise intelligence, 2. Superiority in numbers and position, and 3. Speed of execution. When these elements aligned, total destruction was nearly inevitable. The lesson applies beyond air combat to naval warfare, cyber operations, and modern joint force doctrines. In the end, the Palm Sunday Massacre left a legacy that was both tragic and cautionary. Tragic because it revealed the fragility of human life in the machinery of war. Cautionary because it warned that strategies built on fragile assumptions and denial of reality invite disaster. The Luftwaffe clung to an unsustainable airlift lifeline and paid with thousands of lives and a quarter of its transport fleet.